Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on managing complaints. My name is John Dale Skinner. I'm one of the medico-legal advisors at the MDU, and I am joined today by Edward Farnan, who's another advisor here at the MDU, and also Gerard Ross, who's an advisor as well. In the background, we've got our colleague Cam Nat, who's a marketing executive, and she's dealing with any technical issues you might have, or we might have. Hopefully we don't during this webinar. I suppose the positive to start today is that we're just past the midway point of the working week. I hope you're all having a good week, and those of you who are on call at the weekend, I stand in solidarity. I'm also on call as well. So I'm going to start off with the slides today, and then my colleague Edward is going to talk through some slides as well. Just some housekeeping to begin with. We've got a Q&A, as you can see, and we'd like you to post any questions that you have for us as we go through the slides, and Gerard is going to be having a look at your questions, and then we'll have the Q&A session at the end. Don't worry if you are concerned about posting a question in front of everybody. Only we can see the question, and we will try to answer all of the questions. Sometimes we have to collate the questions if there's a similar theme, but we'll certainly try our best to get through them. So I think after that, we'll get started. So what's our aim today? Well, our ultimate aim is to avoid you having sleepless nights about complaints. We're going to go through some of the statistics to do with NHS complaints, looking at how to investigate a complaint, what to do if a complaint's not resolving. And so I hope that you'll all find some points to take away as learning points. It may be that you're facing a complaint yourself, and this webinar will help you with that. It may be that you are you take a lead role in investigating complaints in your organisation, and certainly I hope there's some points to take away as learning points there. It may be that you're struggling in your organisation with a particularly complex complaint that's not resolving, and again, I would hope there's something here for you as well on that. So just thinking about the number of complaints that the NHS receives, I don't know whether you're all aware of this, but there is data on this that's available online, and you can search for it. And you'll see, unfortunately, there has been a 5.4% increase in the number of written complaints submitted to the NHS when you compare the year 2023 24 to the previous year. But a reassuring thing is over half of these complaints are fully upheld, certainly in the hospital and community services. Just a word of caution when you're looking at the statistics, though, you'll see that they're broken down into themes, which is quite helpful. But at the same time, one complaint may have many different themes to it, so it may feature in different themes. But you can certainly look at complaints by area. So it can make some interesting reading. So we thought we'd just signpost you to that. But let's move on to think about our experience at the MDU when we're assisting members with complaints. And I suppose one of the key points of this talk is that please do seek our advice with your complaints. That's what we're here for. That's where our experience is. And as you can see, we're familiar with these types of themes, these common themes with complaints, and we'd always be happy to advise you if you're investigating a complaint, you're trying to draft a response. We're quite used to looking through doctors, clinicians' responses and making suggestions. And just looking at those themes, I'm sure they won't come as any surprise to you. And those of you who've received a complaint before, you probably remember the first complaint that you've ever got. I certainly do. I can remember it was a complaint about communication and clinical management in a patient with tinnitus. And one of my senior colleagues who was investigating the complaint gave me some quite wise words of advice, which have stayed with me ever since. And she said to me that a good doctor is not liked by everybody. And I suppose there are times when when doctors will need to tell patients things that they don't want to hear. Sometimes you have to say no to patients, and that can prompt a complaint. There are other times where doctors make mistakes. We're all humans, and a complaint can arise from that. But it's important that we try to get it right in terms of investigating and responding to a complaint. I mean, the main reason is, complaints are stressful, they're time consuming, especially if they're not resolved at stage 1 local resolution. So that's one of the main things. And also, trying to keep your relationship with patients who have complained on track. It can be helpful to try to resolve their complaints swiftly, but certainly making sure that you've done a detailed investigation to maintain that professional relationship with them. But I suppose another thing is that from a single clinical incident, it might give rise to a complaint, but also it can give rise to any number of different processes that we see as a medical defence organisation that members face. And certainly a member can face all of these different processes arising from one clinical incident, which may have started as a complaint. And the initial response to that complaint may inform the other processes and certainly might be referred to. So that's why it's really important to try and put your best foot forward, seek appropriate advice, and that's why, investigating complaints thoroughly and providing a timely response is important. So, all formal complaints must be made in writing. It'd be interesting to know if you think that's true or false. Certainly, it's something I do hear from time to time when I'm talking to members, is the sort of remark that, well, they haven't submitted a complaint in writing, so I don't think that it's an actual complaint. I'll just leave that one with you to have a think about that one as we move on to the next slide. And just let's briefly think about, well, how do we define a complaint? There's no statutory definition, but NHS England, in its complaints policy, describes it or defines it as an expression of dissatisfaction, either spoken or written, that requires a response. And I'm aware that we've got members joining us from all different jurisdictions in the UK today, and there will be slight variations in those jurisdictions in terms of complaint handling. But I think that is a good definition there to work with. And then when we think back to that question about whether something is a formal complaint, whether it's an actual complaint, I think this slide helps us. So oral complaints resolved within 1 working day to the satisfaction of the complainant, they can be considered informal. Okay, but any other complaints, so written and oral complaints that can't be resolved in 1 day, these are formal and must be handled in accordance with your regulations in your jurisdiction. And so they're going to require ordinarily an investigation, and a written response. So just thinking about an example complaint here, and I'll read through this. I've recently been discharged from hospital having had an operation to remove a bowel cancer, which has left me with a stoma. I want to know why I wasn't referred urgently when I had constipation back in March and saw the doctor. If I had been, I might not be in my 40s with a stoma bag. And then it goes on to detail difficulties with the stoma bag and the list of repeat medications and the problems this patient, this complainant is experiencing getting the various equipment prescribed. So let's sort of use that as an example complaint to work with. And think about what the first step might be. That would be thinking about how you're going to acknowledge your complaint. And I'm aware that many of you will be working in organizations where you might have a department or a particular individual who will be involved in it, making sure complaints are acknowledged within a timely manner. But yeah, should you be acknowledging complaints? Yes. And it's often our advice, well, it's always our advice to think carefully about the acknowledgement, because there's certain things that you can include in that acknowledgement which can help manage a complainant's expectations and give them a bit of information about or a better understanding of what your understanding of the complaint is, and give them the opportunity to query that if you haven't quite understood what they're complaining about. So, I'll just go back. So acknowledging a complaint, in most jurisdictions, you have to do this within 3 working days. I believe in Wales it is 2 working days. Yeah, you should give the complainant an opportunity to discuss your investigation of the complaint and when the response will be issued. So it can be a helpful opportunity to manage the complainant's expectations here, but also to think about how long you're going to actually take to investigate the complaint. So it's quite important not to set yourself too tight a deadline. There are certain guidelines for responding to complaints in the different jurisdictions, but certainly with complex complaints, these sort of deadlines, and certainly organisations' deadlines, can usually be extended. So sometimes I'm talking to members on the MDU advice line who've been given a very tight deadline to provide a response to a complaint, and usually my advice is, it's reasonable to request an extension if you need it, particularly if you've only just been notified of the complaint and you need time to review the records and to think about how you're going to evidence any reflection or learning. So acknowledging a complaint is a good opportunity, a good step in the investigation of a complaint. Sorry about that, just getting a bit. So we've got some examples here. I think we've got one example of how somebody might acknowledge the complaint that we talked about before. And so you can see that there's an expression of empathy there. There's a statement of understanding what the concerns are. And then there's an indication of how the practice, it's in this case GP practice, are going to investigate the points of concern. And then giving the complainant an indication of how long this is going to take and when they can expect a response by. So as I said, acknowledgement is an opportunity, and set out the points which points of the complaint that will be investigated. And it's also a useful opportunity to think about consent. And again, those of you working in large organizations, it might be the local complaints team that are dealing with the issue of consent. But if you've got a complainant who's complaining on behalf of the patient, then you need to think about consent, or certainly the organisation who's serving the final response needs to consider that. And so sometimes it might be helpful to flag that and query, has the complainant got the consent of the patient? Because in drafting a response, in discussing what happened, you're going to be disclosing the patient's confidential information within the response. And if that's being sent to a third party, you will need the patient's consent to do so. So let's just go back to that response, or that complaint, should I say. We'll have another think about the different points of concern that we would have identified in our, at the acknowledgement stage. And these are the steps that I've identified that the organisation would need to go through to investigate this complaint. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay on my screen, so I'm having a bit of difficulty knowing when the next slide is coming up. But so there's 3 points there for you. So somebody's going to need an account from the receptionist because there was a point of concern raised about phoning the practice and requesting medication by phone. Somebody's going to have to talk to the doctor and get their account of the consultation when the patient first had reported bowel symptoms. And then somebody's going to need to review the clinical management and have a think about whether there are points of reflection, learning points for the practice. So certainly individual clinicians might have their own, which they include in their responses. But when those responses are collated together into a final response from the organisation, it may be that, for example, in general practice, there is a responsible person, a senior member of the partnership who assumes that role of taking an overview of the investigation and then reaching a sort of a decision and topping and tailing the letter and giving an indication what they conclude. And that might be that they've got points to share with other members of staff that they're going to discuss in a meeting. It might be references to guidance. And so this slide is just looking at what things you can use to demonstrate that you've looked at a complaint objectively. And so in the complaint, you've got the complainant's account of what happened, but you should really be trying to think about what should have happened if the doctor or you, if you're involved, should or could have done anything differently. And it's quite appropriate to say if something didn't happen that the complainant is claiming did, and putting forward your account. But trying to sort of balance those accounts, if they're different within a response, can be difficult to achieve, but it certainly is one of the things which can be helpful in trying to resolve a complaint. And then I mentioned this just before, but thinking about whether there are guidelines, referral criteria, whether you might have discussed it with a colleague, a senior colleague. Sometimes GPs will discuss a complaint anonymously with the local specialist or the specialist involved in the patient's care. And that can, of course, inform the sort of the conclusion in the response to the complaint, and can help with identifying any learning points. So let's have a look at some of the things, some of the statements that somebody might be able to put in the response to the complaint that we talked about. So obviously reviewed the complaint, and somebody's come to the conclusion that other doctors within the practice would have done the same as the doctor who was involved. Here, the practice has also demonstrated that they've widely consulted with colleagues about the complaint. They've taken the time to discuss it as a significant event, and they've also reviewed the relevant guidelines. And then there's also a point there about what the doctor established were the symptoms. And so it might be at that point that the person writing the response says, well, these are the symptoms that the doctor documented. These are different to the ones that you're now saying that you presented with, for example. So just sort of more simply splitting it down into 3 sections. If we have a beginning, a middle, and end, when you're thinking about writing a response, and even if you're not actually drafting the response from the organisation, even if this is your own response to a complaint that you've been notified about, where you're being asked for your account of your involvement, it's best to try to draft this as if you're writing to the complainant, as if you're writing the full response, so to speak, so that it's very easy for anybody else who's trying to either trying to incorporate your comments into their final response, or if they simply just enclose your comments, then it reads as if you're writing to the patient or the complainant. So beginning, appropriate introduction. It's always important to add an expression of empathy. Sentences like, I'm sorry you had cause to raise concern about your care. It's quite a nice sentence to use. And an explanation of how you've investigated the complaint, so that you've reviewed the records or you've discussed it with colleagues. And then a middle, explaining what happened from your point of view, from your review of the records, and then turning to each point of concern, trying to address each point, and then thinking about reflection and learning where appropriate. We know that they can be powerful tools in resolving complaints. And then the ending should inform the complainant what to do if they remain dissatisfied. Sometimes organisations will offer to meet the complainant, but very importantly, a complainant needs to be signposted to the Ombudsman if they remain dissatisfied. So I think I'm just going to stop there and hand over to Ed, who's just appeared.
As if by magic. Thank you very much, John. That was very helpful, I think, and I hope to be able to sort of to build on that for the people who are attending. John talked about the importance of analysing a complaint very carefully when you first receive it, going through it point by point to identify which are the issues that you need to address as part of your response. And in doing that and in investigating each of those points, what you also want to do is to identify which of those points, if any, might require or benefit from the inclusion of an apology in your response. So John's talked about the importance of an empathetic opening to your response. So you can say something like, I'm sorry that you had cause to complain, or something like that. Saying that you're sorry that somebody's had cause to complain isn't an apology in and of itself. What we're talking about here is apologies for the specific points of concern that they've raised. It may be on reviewing the complaint in detail, you're satisfied that actually what the patient thinks has gone wrong hasn't necessarily gone wrong, and there may not be a need for an apology as such. That doesn't mean you won't write a conciliatory and reflective response. But often things don't go as well as we would like. If you think about the number of clinical contact you have with a patient over the course of a week or a month or a year, it's inevitable, given the pressures that exist in the NHS, that some things won't go as well as you would want. And it might not be that any individual is responsible for something not going as well as you would want. But if that happens, it's often appropriate to include an apology for the fact that that has happened, or that something has not maybe gone as well as you would have liked. Excuse me. Some doctors do get slightly concerned about including an apology or how to word an apology in case the wording in some way introduces an extra layer of vulnerability for them. And John talked earlier about that concept of multiple jeopardy, where a single clinical incident, for example, can cause a complaint, an inquest, a disciplinary process, GMC investigation, or a claim. What we don't want is for an apology to cause a problem in any of those other scenarios. And I'm hopefully going to be able to reassure you to that extent, in that the Compensation Act in England and Wales, Section 2 of that Act, makes clear that an apology in and of itself does not amount to an admission of negligence or to a breach of duty, which are the things that really are important in the context of a claim, but would apply in other settings too. That's the position in England and Wales. There is something very similar for colleagues in Scotland. There's a Scottish Apologies Act, and essentially it says by and large the same thing, that you should feel free to apologise in the context of something like a complaint response, without necessarily being concerned that that will cause you problems in other settings. There isn't equivalent legislation, to my knowledge, in Northern Ireland, and you might pick up that that's where I am from. I'm aware that the previous Northern Ireland Health Ombudsman, the predecessor to the current one, was keen that that would happen, that something akin to the English Compensation Act or the Scottish Apologies Act would be put in place in Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, for various reasons, the legislative wheels turn slowly, so we haven't quite got there yet, but I think the same principles are likely to apply. So if we're going to talk about apologies, we maybe need to talk about what to say and also what not to say. And to start by saying what we would try not to say in an apology, the first thing is what we describe as a non-apology, or perhaps a false apology. And they've certainly been described as false apologies in previous reports issued by the Ombudsman. And that's things like, I'm sorry if you feel that way. I'm sorry, but I was right. Or I'm sorry if you feel that I've upset you. Those generally are forms of words which are unhelpful. And maybe the best way to think about that is to put yourself in the shoes of a complainant, not necessarily in a healthcare situation, but if you've ever had to complain about anything yourself, the tone of the apology is important. And you know if somebody is sincere in what they say, or if they're trying to shift the blame back to you, essentially, which is what some of these non-apologies or false apologies do. They're not conducive to resolving the concern. Similarly, an overly defensive apology, where you sort of just, the barriers go up, is generally unhelpful. And surprisingly, I suspect, an excessive apology where you go too far, you're too fulsome in the apology. You say more than is needed. There's too much of a mea culpa, a mea maxima culpa than is necessary. That's what's not to say. Well, what should you say? Well, we're doctors, we're scientists, and it's helpful, I think, to have some form of evidence base when we try and say what is an apology that is effective. This is taken from a study. It wasn't a study in a healthcare setting. This was a study where 700 participants were involved, in fact, in 2 studies, and they were asked to rate written apologies which were in response to a scenario where a tax return had been filed incorrectly, fictional scenario. And the participants were asked to rate how effective or credible or adequate the apologies were. And the apologies could contain one of these elements, or a group of 3, or perhaps all 6 of the elements. And what it was found was that the greater of the number of these elements that were included, the more effective the apology was deemed to be, but also that some of the components are more effective than others. An acknowledgement of responsibility was viewed as being the most important and effective, with an offer of repair being second and an explanation third. Both studies revealed that when an apology contained an explanation, an acknowledgement of responsibility, and an offer of repair, the apology was perceived as being significantly more effective than when it only contained an expression of regret or a declaration of repentance or a request for forgiveness. And you might be glad to know that the request for forgiveness was felt to be the least effective. So how does that apply in practice? Well, if you look at the GMC's guidance on apologies, this is from Good Medical Practice, the 2024 version, the most recent active version, but the previous wording in the 2013 version was almost identical. And it's also reflected in their supplementary publication on the professional duty of candor. So it says you must be open and honest with patients if things go wrong. And if a patient under your care is the acknowledgement of responsibility, which is the most effective thing, or one of the most effective things, has suffered harm, then you should put matters right if possible. And that's the offer of repair, which we know is an effective element of this. You should apologize, which is the expression of regret. And you should explain fully and promptly what has happened. And that explanation of what went wrong is the fourth important strand of that study. So the GMC's guidance does, whether it was intentional or not, have a degree of an evidence base behind it in terms of what constitutes an effective apology. The question then is how should I say sorry? Well, I would suggest that it's best if you can express regret in the first person. That means by saying happened rather than saying it is to be regretted that this happened or something to that effect. Owning the apology, I think, is important and helpful. I would also say that you try not to allow your own personal emotional reaction to impact on your apology. If something has gone wrong, if a patient has come to harm, or if things have just not worked out the way we wanted, it affects the patient clearly, but it also affects the doctor. And this is the concept of the second victim, the doctor being that second victim when there has been an adverse event or when something has gone wrong. That triggers an emotional response in the doctor because they are the victim of what happened as well. But while that emotional response is important and should be recognized, and if you're the doctor in question, it's important that you're supported through that process, including your own emotional response in the apology to the patient is probably not helpful. You should allow time for questioning, and I'll come on to that when I talk about meetings with patients. As I say, concentrate on the feelings of the patient, not your own. So in terms of meetings with a complainant, whether that's an apology meeting or just a meeting to discuss the complaint or the response, you ask maybe, why should you have a meeting? Well, sometimes the written response, even if you've gone through all the steps that John talked about and identified the issues to be addressed, if you've carefully considered them, if you've given a good explanation with evidence of reflection, with evidence of learning, an apology if one's appropriate, patients sometimes still aren't satisfied. It may be because, in some cases, nothing you will say will satisfy them, but it also might be because what needs to be communicated hasn't been communicated as effectively as it might have been. So there's a chance to resolve anything which has not yet been fully resolved. When should the meeting take place? Where should the meeting take place? Well, ideally at a mutually convenient time and with sufficient time. What you don't want is to try and resolve a complex complaint in a 10-minute consultation in the middle of an otherwise busy surgery when people are knocking your door, you're taking phone calls, and so on. Ideally, it should be in a certain amount of protected time. How much time? Well, we can think about that in a moment. It should be in an appropriate venue. Now, often that will be in a consulting room where you're used to seeing patients, but some patients might not want it there. A separate meeting room, a manager's office, a dedicated meeting room for other purposes. Occasionally, it might need to take place off-site if something has particularly triggered the patient. They don't want to come back until matters are properly resolved. And then who should be at the meeting? Well, the patient clearly should be there. It's often helpful for them to take a supporter with them. The people who are relevant to the complaint, the people who have been complained about, should be offered the opportunity of attending, but with a certain amount of discretion. If a complaint is lengthy and complex and involves numerous people, it's unlikely to be helpful to have everybody sitting at one side of the table with one patient and maybe one supporter on the other. So you need to be proportionate if possible. There should ideally be a note taker present who's not otherwise involved, so that you've got a detailed minute of the meeting which you can fall back on and refer to when you provide any further response.
Ed, can I make one comment? Do you mind about people who attend with these sorts of meetings? We often, or I've seen a few times recently, people wanting to take their lawyer along to a meeting, or their solicitor, to use the terminology correctly. So that would be a situation in which we'd probably suggest you chat to us, or if you're employed in a trust or health board, chat to the management of that, because that's probably not going to be appropriate.
Yeah, that suggests an escalation of the process beyond the complaints process. I agree that that's unlikely to be an appropriate person to attend. Somebody from a complaints advocacy service, a family member, a friend, somebody who can support them and make sure that they've got all their points covered is helpful. But a solicitor, a legal representative, is probably a bridge too far. As part of that, you're going to try and agree in advance what to discuss. It's helpful.
Ed, we're having some problems with your feed, I think. You seem to be freezing quite a lot there. John, do you want
to try and figure out in advance and maybe have an initial discussion in advance?
Ed, are you aware you're having some problems with your feed, I think? John, do you want to carry on from where Ed is? I think it's slide 30.
Sure, let's have a look.
Is that okay, Ed? I'm sorry, it's just it's breaking down.
So Ed was talking
That's
about.
Absolutely fine.
Okay, so Ed was talking about preparing for a meeting. So important to contact the patient to agree what issues will be discussed in the meeting, set a duration for the meeting. I think it's always important to set out explain who's going to be there at the meeting, and usually there'll be someone taking minutes. That might be a member of the local your organisation's complaints team. In a GP practice, it may be the practice manager. And we've got appropriate venue there who will be acting as the chair. And that might be, for example, in a GP practice, a senior partner who's the responsible person for the complaint. And then after the meeting, yes, it doesn't just stop with the meeting. I think meetings can be very helpful, but you need to think about summarising the outcome of the meeting in a letter to the patient, giving them the opportunity to have a copy of the minutes or the recording of the meeting, and then reiterating, I'll just go back, reiterating what they can do if they remain dissatisfied. So just on that point of meetings, sometimes members have said that they've tried to arrange a meeting sort of almost at the point of acknowledging a complaint, so trying to sort of meet and sort it out there and then. And I always sort of suggest that it may not be that, although I appreciate you want to talk to the complainant about what they're complaining about and try to establish the points of concern before you meet them, give yourself time to investigate the complaint. There's no point in scheduling a meeting before you've investigated it. And certainly a good time to have a meeting would be after you've served a response and the patient or the complainant has requested one. And then what can the complainant do if they remain dissatisfied? Well, they might submit a further complaint and you can investigate then any new concerns. You could review your position on the first response. You can consider a meeting, as we've discussed. But sometimes, having reviewed your position, you might not have anything more to add. And so it can be quite appropriate to say, we've reviewed your second complaint. Doesn't appear to raise new concerns, and we think we've addressed these points of concern that you've had in our first response, and we've done our best to do that. And if you remain dissatisfied with that, then you're free to go to the Ombudsman if you wish. And so the Ombudsman, for those of you who don't know, have a duty to investigate complaints where the complainant is dissatisfied, and they're specifically looking at injustice and hardship arising from a failure in a service, failing to provide a service, or its maladministration. So essentially the Ombudsman can look at the clinical concerns, so the clinical aspects of the case, but they can also look at the way your organisation has handled the complaint. And so that's why we keep pressing the point of handling a complaint is important, because the Ombudsman can raise concerns about how you've handled the complaint if they have any concerns on that. So this is our summary, actually, and then we'll get on to the Q&A. Analyse complaints carefully. Well, I hope that we've taken you through various steps which you'll be able to take away, remember, think about where you are in the investigation process of a complaint. And certainly, I hope you've got some pointers on how to structure a response. Also, we do get questions about meetings. When should you schedule a meeting? Who should be involved? And I hope you've got some more information about that. But certainly, as I said right at the start, with individual cases, please do contact us and seek individual advice. You can do that by using our online case reporting function, emailing us, and also phoning the MDU advice line. And I hope we just touched on at the end there the Ombudsman investigation as well. So we've had a couple of difficulties with the technical aspects, I think, but you're still lucky enough to have us, all three of us here. So there we go, to do some questions and answers.
So I've been working in the background, trying to fire off answers to some of the questions that came in. There have been some really good questions, which I've been trying to group into areas that we could try and address together. One of the questions that came in is one that we don't often get asked, but I think it comes into people's minds, and I'm just going to address it up front to give the guys who've been talking a bit of a breather. Somebody said, if I call the MDU or open a file with the MDU, or we do that a few times in the practice or in the practice, doesn't mean that our fees will go up. Okay, so we do sometimes get asked that question. The answer is, in general, it doesn't have any impact at all. It would be remiss of us with our members' money, because remember, it's not our money, it's your money as members. It would be remiss of us not to pay attention to doctors or practices who are extreme outliers. So we do look at those situations, but it's a rare thing. So for most people dealing with, a practice with lots of complaints coming through, because that's just the nature of practice, complaints come in, it's not going to be an issue. So if that's any reassurance. So I'm going to start with, we've got quite a few lead clinicians for various aspects of care in the audience. So there are obviously a lot of GPs, but there are some hospital doctors too. So the first one that came in was from a lead clinician, sorry, dropping my pen, who has a doctor working as a locum in the department. The doctor is also a full-time doctor elsewhere. So he's a consultant working elsewhere as a consultant. He does locums in their department, but he won't engage with the complaint because he's not being paid by the trust to do so. Any thoughts on that, guys?
Yes, certainly.
I'll jump in because John's talked far more than me. And if I bore my router to sleep again, you can let me know. I think that doctor could find themselves vulnerable to criticism, is the first thing to say. It's the organisation to which the complaint is made which has the responsibility for investigating and providing a response. So the lead clinician is right to be taking the lead in that. But part of that is to engage all of the other clinicians who are involved in the patient's care, which has given rise to the complaint. And inviting that doctor to contribute to the response is the correct thing to do. If you look at GMC guidance, for example, it expects that doctors who are the subject of a complaint or the object of a complaint will engage with the process, and that forms an important part of the appraisal process. It forms an important part of the revalidation process, and a doctor who fails to engage in those processes could be criticised for not doing so.
So, Dr. L, that's your answer. If they're not engaging, that's a serious concern and it needs to be dealt with, but the trust or the health board still remains the people who have to deal with the complaint. As an endoscopy clinical lead, I'm often emailed about complaints about other people. Am I right in refusing to deal with these issues and asking that the people involved themselves are directly asked to address the complainant's issues? I'll take that one. Like you guys. So it depends on your role in the organization, really, Doctor. So if you are the person who's been asked to provide the response, then that's the role that you've got. If you are the manager in charge of it and you've got a role in reviewing all of these things, then again, that's your role. But if you are just somebody who's available and they come to you about it, then you should be directing the complaints to the right people in the organization to make sure that the complaints are addressed. But I guess as a clinical lead, if you're seeing lots of complaints about one particular operator, in this case, that's probably going to feed into your sort of clinical dashboard of concerns and give you some things to think about. So the answer is it depends, I think. Guys, that seem fair?
Yep.
Okay, so the next thing that's come up, I think it's a sort of sign of the times, is AI.
Absolutely. Nothing to add to that.
Is AI has come up. Somebody said that they're seeing lots of complaints which appear to have been written by AI, which I haven't come across yet, but that's what they're saying. And then somebody else has commented on the use of AI in healthcare. So it's a two-part question, I guess. Can practices use AI to help draft responses? And secondly, are there problems that arise from the use of AI in medicine? I don't want an essay, just a quick summary.
Well, I certainly think that if you're using any tool to help draft something, you need to be careful of patient confidentiality. So that's my first sort of point. I think, yes, patients can use what they want, I suppose. They use advocates. They might use something like AI to draft their complaints. And yes, well, often members are requesting assistance from us. I think sometimes members look up templates online, or there are resources at the trust. So I think members should be using whatever tools they can in order to draft their responses. But most key is confidentiality if you're entering anything into something online. And the second thing is making sure that what you're writing is an honest and truthful and accurate account. Yeah. So, making sure you read whatever it is that you're drafting, or the template you use, tool you've used, to make sure it's an accurate account, because you're going to have to stand by that. And that's one of the obligations of being a doctor, to draft honest, trustworthy reports.
And I think that's the crucial point, is that you are responsible for the tools you use, just as as a surgeon, you're responsible if you decide to use a particular form of diathermy. If you start using a particular AI tool, then you are responsible for it. And actually, there's a whole world of statutory controls and non-statutory controls in place for the use of AI, and lots of guidance out there. It's actually really complicated, and it's probably not something that individual doctors should start doing off their own bat. They're likely to end up in difficulty if they start doing that. They should probably take advice on doing that, and it should ideally be sort of introduced at a strategic level by a big organization, or by an organization rather than individually by a doctor. We all know that AI does make stuff up as well. Sometimes patients do, but AI just adds to that mix with even more stuff being confabulated and made up. We've got a lot of questions. I'm sorry, as often happens in complaints or in webinars, we get a lot of questions at the end that are sort of piling in now. So I apologize that we're just not going to be able to address them. I'm trying to group some together though. Consent issues have come up because I think one of you mentioned the idea of consent, and there have been 3 separate questions at least on them. One to do with, if you've got a 16 to 18-year-old, you have to get their consent. What about adults who don't have capacity? And how do we get consent from dead people? I'm sorry, that's obviously a bit tongue-in-cheek. That's not what the question was. But how do we address the issue of consent for releasing information about dead patients?
If I take those in order, with increasing age, perhaps starting with the 16 to 18-year-olds and even younger, 16 to 18-year-olds are essentially deemed to have capacity to give consent. But even before that, some 15, 14, 13-year-olds perhaps will have sufficient maturity to give consent as well. And in those situations, it's generally appropriate, if their parent is complaining on their behalf, to seek consent from the young person before you respond to the parent. And that's going to be on a case-by-case basis for the kids who are under 16, just depending on their own level of maturity. For 16 to 18-year-olds, it's generally more appropriate to seek consent from the young person before you respond to their parent. For patients who lack capacity, then I think that the organisation, whether that's a GP practice or a trust or a health board, will have a responsibility to determine whether or not the complainant is an appropriate person to complain on that patient's behalf. And that sometimes is very straightforward. If it's a family member who's their permanent carer, for example. In other cases, it might be slightly more difficult, but again, it's on a case-by-case basis. And if it was somebody who was closely involved in their care, if it's a spouse or a family member who was sort of resident with them and there was no evidence of any difficulties, that's probably fine. If it's a great niece who has made contact from another country and you've never heard of who they are, and the family aren't happy for them to act as the complainant, then that's a different approach. So I think you take each case on its own merits.
Yeah, okay. And the deceased individuals was the last one there. So I think you broke up slightly. I'm not sure if you spoke there, but as regards deceased individuals, it would really be a matter of, you're talking about releasing information that's confidential. So you probably want to double check with the person who holds probate, the executor of the estate, that they're happy that the information is released. Is probably a reasonable approach to it. But also, that's to do with actually releasing records and things. If you're just releasing information, the GMC guidance on confidentiality talks about supporting the families of deceased individuals by sharing information with them, as long as you're not aware that the person definitely didn't want you to do that, or for other reasons they don't think it's appropriate. So the concerns about releasing information about those who are deceased are generally less than those who are up and about. So again, there's lots of complaints, lots of issues are coming. I'm sorry. I'd appreciate your thoughts on patients recording complaints meetings. John, do you want to take that one?
I'll take that one briefly. So yes, they're entitled to do that. You must agree to it. Likewise, my advice is to take minutes or record the meeting yourselves. I think that's helpful because then there's no debate about what was discussed and what were the agreed outcomes.
You're not likely to cause a massive problem unless you say something like, this happened, we caused you harm, and because of, and that obviously you've suffered a loss. John, you're the claims handler in a previous life, so you know all about this, but I don't think you're likely to cause a massive problem in having a meeting and having that recorded. The person who actually wrote in, this is one of the people who mentioned having a solicitor there. And I think our advice on solicitors still stands, Dr. H. Somebody else has asked, what's happening with the abolition of NHS England? Well, I don't think we can answer that. We just know that it's happening. But they're thinking about how complaints used to come into practice in England. Apologies for people like me who are not in England. So these are, historically, complainants could either go to the practices themselves or to NHS England. That's now been taken over by the ICB, and they're having lots of restructuring as we speak. But the question actually is, do we need to tailor the response? Let's imagine the complaint actually comes in through the GMC, which is what this person's asked about. Do we have to respond differently? And the short answer to that is yes. If you have a response, if you have a complaint about what you've done that comes to you through the GMC, you're going to come to us. You aren't going to start firing off responses about that to the GMC because it's probably not going to help, and it could potentially make it worse. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah.
All right. So I don't think that the response from my employers is accurate. What should I do about that? The person's in a trust.
Yeah, I think you're to some extent always at the mercy of a trust. Certainly when trust-employed doctors seek our advice about responding to a complaint, my advice is invariably to ask to see the trust response before it is sent to ensure that it reflects your views. And that way you've got the opportunity of correcting something if possible, if that can be agreed, before the response is sent. If it happens after the event, if you don't get that chance to see the response before it's sent, then I think it's also sensible to flag that to the relevant people within the trust to say which bits of the response you've got a problem with and why, so that if there is some comeback, you've got essentially you've equalised before they've scored, which is always a good thing.
You've equalised before they're scored. That's what we want to see in Scottish football happening more frequently. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen that often. But I think particularly for doctors on rotation and for junior doctors more generally, it's important to make sure that you are around to be able to see what's being written. And for that to happen, given that you might well have moved on, it's important that you let somebody know how to contact you so they can share the information with you. A simpler one, perhaps, is a complaint the same as negative feedback?
I've had a look at this one, and I think if there's any query about whether something is a complaint, you can always ask the patient or the complainant, are you making a complaint? Do you want me to investigate this in line with our organisation's complaint procedure? And if you're a junior member of staff discussing it with a senior member of staff, they've probably seen it all before and will give you some very wise advice as well. But of course, also, we're always available on the 24-hour advice line to answer any queries that you might have.
We're coming towards the end of the evening, and I'm really grateful for all these questions. Somebody has just flagged up something which I'm actually quite glad to see, because it's something that we have a problem with. So Dr. R says, I'm a GP partner and a complaints lead. Different GPs in the practice are members of different defence unions. So complete surprise to me, there are other defence unions. If a complaint involves GPs with different defence organisations, it's quite difficult to collate them, because often you get two sets of slightly different advice from different organisations. Is it advisable for GPs to be in one defence organisation if they're in a practice? Sell the MDU. There you go, John.
Well, I think it could make things easier, but yes, we can only advise the members who request assistance from us, other clinicians involved in the complaint will need to seek their own advice.
It does cause a problem, and particularly in England, I think it causes problems, and Northern Ireland and Wales, particularly when a complaint actually revolves around a death and it involves the coroner. Then it can be a real problem, because you're trying to coordinate 2 or 3 defence unions to get cover for the practice, because often these days the coroners make the practice what's called interested party, and they're the ones who've got to be defended, not the individuals by themselves. So let's have a look, see if there's anything else. We're 3 minutes past. I'll do one more question. Oh, here's one. The MDU are always go on about saying sorry. Do I have to say sorry if I don't think that anything wrong has been done, or that I think the patient is lying?
No, I would say a clear no to that. You should only apologise for things that merit an apology. You can still be empathetic and conciliatory and reflective and try your best to resolve the patient's concerns. But if there's nothing to apologise for, then you don't need to apologise. If there is something to apologise for, then you probably should.
John, I don't think you can add to that. You're going to agree with that, I assume. I completely agree. And although we're always going on about apologies, we don't expect people to apologise for everything. If you haven't done anything wrong, there's nothing to say sorry for. So no is the short answer. And at that, I'm going to wrap it up. And I'm conscious that there were 73 different sets of questions. And we only got through a small fraction of those. So I'm really sorry if there's anything that, if your question came in, we didn't get a chance to do it. So do you want to wrap up, John?
Yeah, well, it's just to thank you all for giving us some time on your Wednesday evening, and I hope you've all found that helpful. And we look forward to seeing you at another MDU webinar.
Great stuff. Good night, everybody.
Good night from me.